The smell of pine and morning coffee. That's what I remember from the last peaceful moment of my life. I'm sitting on my cabin porch with State Attorney General Morrison discussing a $2 million environmental grant over breakfast when the sound hits me. Diesel engine roaring, gravel crunching, then slam. A black Escalade parks right on my Bionas. Out steps a woman who looks like she eats small children for breakfast. Designer heels clicking on my wooden steps. She shoves a camera in my face while the state's top prosecutor is literally sitting next to me. "This illegal structure is condemned," she shouts. "I'm Brenda Castellanos, HOA president, and you're done." Attorney General Morrison nearly chokes on his coffee. "Excuse me, ma'am." "Someone," I interrupt, watching her lackeyess photograph my solar panels who just made the biggest mistake of her life. Brenda didn't know she was declaring war on a guy having breakfast with the state's most powerful prosecutor. What would you do if your HOA attacked you during a meeting with government officials? Comment where you're watching from. I bet you have HOA horror stories that'll make your blood boil. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up having breakfast with the most powerful prosecutor in the state while a lunatic HOA president declared war on my dead wife's dream. My name is Garrett Reynolds, 52 years old, retired electrical engineer who spent 30 years designing smart grids for half the municipalities in this state. I made my money selling patents for technology that keeps your lights on, then figured I'd earned the right to disappear into the mountains. The cabin belonged to my grandfather, a mining engineer who bought 40 acres in Cascade Valley back when Calvin Coolidge was president. When I inherited this place 3 years ago, it came with something more valuable than land. Sarah's final wish. My wife died of cancer 2 years back, but before the morphine took her words away, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hospital's beeping machines. "Turn our valley into something beautiful. Show kids what we're fighting to save." The smell of antiseptic and dying flowers in that hospital room still haunts me. But keeping that promise, that's what gets me up every morning. So, I'd been converting the old mining buildings into classrooms, installing solar panels that gleamed like mirrors against ancient pine trees, creating the kind of place where city kids could learn that nature isn't just a screensaver. Which explains why Attorney General Morrison was sitting on my porch at dawn, reviewing my federal grant application over bacon and eggs cooked on a wood-burning stove. $2 million, Morrison had been saying, tapping my proposal with obvious approval. The governor specifically asked me to fast-track environmental education projects. This place could be a model for the entire region. We were discussing construction timelines when the morning peace shattered. The scent of wood smoke and coffee got steamrolled by diesel exhaust as that black Escalade announced itself like an invasion force. Morrison and I watched this woman emerge from her vehicle like she was stepping onto a conquered battlefield. Her heels clicked against my grandfather's hand-laid stone steps. Sharp, aggressive sounds that seemed designed to intimidate. "This illegal operation is shut down," she announced, apparently unimpressed that I was conducting official state business. "I'm Brenda Castellanos, president of Cascade Valley Estates HOA, and this environmental camp ends right now." I watched Morrison's face transform. One second he's a friendly government official discussing grant funding. The next he's a federal prosecutor watching someone commit what might be civil rights violations in real time. The recording device Morrison pressed into my palm felt warm from his pocket. "Document everything," he whispered as he stood. "Emergency call from the governor's office. I'll be in touch within hours." Brenda practically purred with satisfaction, watching Morrison's sedan disappear down the mountain road. She thought she'd scared off some random bureaucrat. She had no idea she'd just threatened a federal grant recipient in front of the state's chief law enforcement officer. "Smart move. Getting rid of your government friend," she said, shoving papers at me that reeked of cheap printer toner and desperation. $15,000 in compliance fees, plus removal of every solar panel within 30 days. Compliance with what exactly? Community aesthetic standards. She photographed my solar installation like she was documenting war crimes. "Your property violates covenant restrictions on renewable energy systems that create visual pollution." Here's where Brenda's legal theory hit a small snag. My property predates her precious HOA by roughly 8 decades. My grandfather bought this land when her luxury development was still a gleam in some con artist's eye. But watching her document my violations with the intensity of a crime scene photographer, I realized this wasn't about aesthetics. This was about a bully who'd gotten used to crushing anyone who didn't fit her suburban fantasy. The wind chimes Sarah had hung on the porch tinkled softly in the morning breeze. A gentle sound completely at odds with Brenda's harsh demands. Those chimes had been Sarah's way of bringing music to our mountain sanctuary. Brenda Castellanos had just declared war on my dead wife's memory. The next morning, I'm sipping coffee and reading Morrison's encrypted text when that familiar diesel rumble returns. But this time, it's not Brenda's Escalade. It's a county inspection truck that sounds like it runs on hopes and dreams. Out steps Dale Kruger, clipboard clutched like a shield, looking about as comfortable as a vegetarian at a barbecue contest. The morning air carries the scent of pine sap and his obvious nervousness as he trudges toward my porch. Mr. Reynolds, Dale Kruger, County Building Inspector. Got complaints about your electrical system. Through my binoculars, I spot Brenda's black SUV lurking at the tree-in like a suburban predator. The woman apparently has nothing better to do than cosplay as a spy. What kind of complaints, Dale? Your off-grid solar allegedly violates county codes. I'm authorized to red tag everything and order immediate shutdown. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Mrs. Castellanos filed formal paperwork. Mrs. Castellanos designs strip malls, not electrical systems. Kruger's voice drops to a whisper. She's offering serious money to make problems disappear. $8,000 for emergency inspection fees or I shut you down today. That's when my phone explodes with calls. Parents asking about the kids' environmental camp I'd been planning. Somehow word had leaked about electrical safety issues. And now 20 families were panicking about whether their children would be electrocuted by solar panels. The timing felt a little too convenient. Here's the thing about electrical codes that most people don't realize. I learned this the hard way during my 30 years designing municipal systems. Self-contained solar setups under 10 kW don't need permits if they're completely off-grid. The regulations only kick in when you're connecting to the public electrical system. It's one of those technical details that separates actual expertise from bureaucratic theater. Dale, I say, setting down my coffee. Who do you think wrote the county's electrical inspection protocols? His clipboard develops a noticeable tremor. I don't. I did. 1998. Want to see my original documentation? I produce a folder thick with official stamps and engineering certifications, every safety standard, every protocol requirement, every code compliance measure, all bearing my signature as the original design engineer. The color drains from Kruger's face like someone pulled a plug. This is like watching someone try to explain fire safety to the guy who invented the fire extinguisher. Your system exceeds every standard by about 300%. I continue. So, here's the new plan. You withdraw that red tag and I don't file bribery charges with the state licensing board. Kruger practically levitates off my porch. I'll need to review my findings. Within an hour, my phone buzzes with another encrypted message from Morrison. Kruger's inspection history under federal review. Pattern of fraudulent red tags across 3 counties, all connected to development projects. The federal machinery is already grinding into motion, but Brenda thinks she's fighting some grieving hermit with a few solar panels. She has no idea she just declared war on someone with the state attorney general's direct number. That evening, my neighbor Magnus Olson appears with a mason jar of moonshine that could probably power a small aircraft. At 78, Magnus has survived enough mountain politics to recognize the scent of trouble in the wind. That HOA which came sniffing around my place too, he says, settling into Sarah's old rocking chair. The wood cacks in harmony with evening wind through the pines, a sound that always brings back her laugh. What kind of sniffing? Photographing my well house, measuring distances to everything. Claims my septic might be an environmental hazard. Magnus takes a sip that would kill a normal person. Funny thing, though, I've got surveyor maps in my basement. Original documents from when Daddy homesteaded here in 1887. My engineering brain starts calculating. Property surveys from the 1880s would show original boundary lines, water rights, federal land designations, the kind of historical documentation that modern developers sometimes prefer to ignore. Think I could look at those maps? Magnus' weathered face splits into a grin. Son, I was hoping you'd ask. Got a feeling those old papers might tell us exactly why this HOA lady's so desperate to control our valley. As twilight paints the mountains in gold and purple, I realize Brenda's first attack just handed me 3 gifts. Evidence of corruption, federal backing, and a neighbor with potentially explosive historical documents. The sound of Magnus' moonshine jar hitting the porch railing echoes through the evening quiet. Tomorrow, Brenda would escalate again. But tonight, for the first time since this war started, I'm actually eager to see what she tries next. Sometimes the best defense is letting your enemy think they're winning while you build a fortress they can't see. A week later, I'm setting up outdoor science stations for the first group of visiting kids when a truck I don't recognize pulls into my driveway. Cascade Environmental Solutions painted on the side in letters so fresh the paint probably isn't dry yet. Out steps a guy who screams, "Fake it till you make it." Expensive boots, brand new clipboard, and the kind of overconfidence that comes from never being questioned. Rico Castellanos. Yeah, same last name as our HOA dictator. Keeping the corruption in the family, apparently. Rico Castellanos, certified environmental consultant, he announces like he's introducing himself at the Oscars. Emergency complaint filed about groundwater contamination. Need to test your well immediately. The 20 kids I'm teaching about mountain ecosystems suddenly look worried. Their parents trusted me with their children. And now some guy in a hard hat is talking about poison water. What kind of contamination? I ask, watching Rico unpack testing equipment that still has Home Depot price stickers. The dangerous kind that requires immediate evacuation. He's collecting water samples with all the scientific precision of someone making Kool-Aid. My preliminary analysis shows serious contamination levels. Here's something from my engineering days that most people don't know. Real environmental testing requires proper sample handling, certified labs, and documented chain of custody procedures. A guy with a drugstore pH meter collecting samples in recycled pickle jars isn't exactly following EPA protocol. Rico spends exactly 4 minutes analyzing my water before announcing his verdict. Confirm contamination. Health department will receive my emergency report within the hour. You'll need immediate septic replacement $25,000 through my recommended contractor. That's when the trap springs. My phone rings with a call that makes my blood freeze. Mr. Reynolds, this is County Health Department. We're ordering immediate evacuation of all persons from your property due to emergency environmental hazards. You have 1 hour to clear the premises. 20 kids, 20 parents who trusted me, and now I'm supposed to tell them their children might have been exposed to contaminated water while learning about environmental protection. The irony tastes like ashes in my mouth. But here's where Rico's amateur hour performance falls apart. I notice him photographing not just my well, but my solar installation, my workshop, even Sarah's memorial garden. Environmental consultants test water. They don't conduct property appraisals. Rico, I say, mind showing me your state certification? His swagger evaporates faster than mountain mist in sunshine. My credentials are currently being renewed with the licensing board, which means you don't have any. 20 minutes later, a federal vehicle arrives that makes Rico's truck look like a toy. EPA agent Patricia Hayes steps out with the kind of equipment that costs more than Rico's entire operation and the no-nonsense expression of someone who's dealt with actual environmental disasters. Mr. Reynolds, EPA Regional Office. We received reports about water contamination. She glances at Rico, who's suddenly very interested in his phone screen. Standard protocol requires independent federal verification for evacuation orders. Rico's fake equipment disappears into his truck like evidence at a crime scene. Got other appointments? He mumbles, tearing down the mountain road so fast he leaves rubber on my gravel. Agent Hayes runs proper tests with sealed containers, certified procedures, and actual scientific methodology. The kind where samples go to real laboratories instead of getting eyeballed by someone's cousin with a chemistry set. Results arrive the next day. My well water is cleaner than most municipal supplies. But here's the kicker. Rico's contaminated samples actually came from Poison Creek, 2 miles away, near an abandoned mining operation. His environmental expertise apparently didn't include knowing which body of water he was testing. Your boy Rico's got some explaining to do, I tell Brenda when she calls, demanding payment for his emergency consultation. Rico is a certified professional. Rico's certification apparently didn't cover basic geography. He tested the wrong creek. The silence stretches long enough for me to hear her brain recalculating. Then this valley will be developed one way or another. That evening, Morrison calls with news that changes everything. Rico's cooperating with federal investigation. Turns out your HOA president's been running the same contamination scam across 3 counties. Always the same pattern. Fake environmental crisis, forced evacuation, property acquisition. Magnus arrives with his evening moonshine and those historical documents we discussed. The 1887 surveyor maps feel fragile as ancient secrets between my fingers. Look here, Magnus says, pointing to faded boundary markers. According to these original surveys, that entire HOA development sits on federal land that was illegally transferred in the 1970s. The implications hit like an avalanche. If these maps are accurate, Brenda's luxury development is built on stolen government property. No wonder she's desperate to control the surrounding historic properties. We're witnesses to the original boundaries. The taste of Magnus moonshine burns away the day's stress as stars appear overhead. Brenda's environmental warfare just handed me federal allies and evidence that could destroy her entire empire. Sometimes your enemy's desperation is your greatest weapon. I'm teaching a group of teenagers how to identify edible mountain plants when the certified letter arrives, delivered by a courier who looks like he'd rather be handling radioactive waste. The envelope bears the official seal of Cascade County Zoning Board and its contents make my blood pressure spike into orbit. Notice of immediate cease operations, unlicensed commercial recreation facility. 30 kids are arriving tomorrow for the first official Sarah Reynolds Environmental Learning Center session. Their parents have driven from 3 states, taken vacation time, paid program fees, and now some bureaucrats are claiming I'm running an illegal summer camp that violates commercial zoning restrictions. The retroactive permit fees alone would cost $40,000, more than I've spent on the entire facility. My phone explodes with Morrison's ringtone before I finish reading the legal nightmare. Emergency zoning hearing in 2 hours, he says without preamble. They're trying to shut you down before your federal grant gets approved. Can they do that? Not if we move fast. File nonprofit incorporation immediately. But Garrett, this hearing feels like a setup. Someone leaked your federal grant application. The betrayal hits harder than the legal threat. Only 3 people knew about the federal funding timeline. Morrison, myself, and whoever Morrison had discussed it with in confidence. Someone with access to federal grant information had fed details to Brenda's zoning board allies. I spent 90 minutes racing through IRS Form 1023, documenting every lesson plan, every educational objective, every environmental protection goal Sarah and I had dreamed about. The paperwork feels like armor. Bureaucratic protection against bureaucratic attack. The zoning hearing takes place in a conference room that reeks of institutional cleaning supplies and political corruption. Chairman Wesley Park fidgets with documents while board members Janet Kowalski and Robert Sage avoid eye contact. They know this is a hit job, but they're going through the motions anyway. Brenda sits front row center with an evidence folder thick enough to stop bullets, practically purring with anticipated victory. Mr. Reynolds, Park begins reluctantly. You're operating an unlicensed commercial facility in violation of County Ordinance July 2 ND 14. The board has received complaints about unpermitted recreational activities involving minors. What complaints? Brenda stands like a prosecutor addressing a jury. 30 children arriving tomorrow for paid camping activities. Clear commercial operation disguised as environmental education. The county has photographic evidence of commercial playground equipment, overnight accommodations, and fee-based instruction. She's not wrong about the facts, just the interpretation. But then comes the trap I didn't see coming. Furthermore, Brenda continues, producing a document that makes my stomach drop. Federal grant applications clearly state this will be a regional educational facility serving hundreds of students annually. That's not a private hobby. That's a commercial enterprise requiring full recreational facility licensing. The room goes silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Someone had leaked my federal grant application word for word. The same application that demonstrated legitimate educational purposes now became evidence of commercial intent. That's when I realized Morrison's federal protection isn't coming fast enough. These board members are scared, probably threatened or bribed, but they're going to vote against me anyway. Gentlemen, I say, opening my laptop with hands that aren't quite steady. I'd like to submit federal nonprofit incorporation documents for the Sarah Reynolds Environmental Learning Center, filed this morning with expedited processing. Wesley Park's face shows genuine surprise. You incorporated as a nonprofit today? 6 hours ago. IRS approval pending, but educational nonprofits operate under federal jurisdiction during review periods. I turn my screen toward the board, watching their expressions shift from resignation to confusion. Local zoning restrictions don't apply to federally protected educational activities. The legal alchemy works like magic. Educational nonprofits exist in a different regulatory universe, one where county zoning boards have about as much authority as homeowners associations trying to regulate NASA. This is absurd. Brenda's composure cracks like ice in spring. You can't just incorporate your way out of zoning violations. Actually, Janet Kowalski says quietly, consulting her legal manual. Federal nonprofit status does create jurisdictional complications for local enforcement. The sound of Brenda's evidence folder slamming shut echoes through the room like a coffin lid. She knows she's been outflanked, but her expression promises this war is far from over. That evening, I'm sitting on the porch with Magnus when my phone buzzes with a message that changes everything. Federal grant approved, $2.1 million. Environmental Education Center officially authorized. Morrison. Good news, Magnus asks, noting my expression. The best, but Magnus, someone with federal access, leaked my grant application to Brenda. This goes deeper than local HOA corruption. The old logger's weathered face hardens. Son, I've been thinking about those surveyor maps. Maybe it's time we shared them with your federal friends. The scent of wood smoke from my stove mingles with mountain air as stars appear overhead. Brenda's zoning attack just forced me to incorporate federal protections that make me legally untouchable. But more importantly, we now know she has allies inside the federal system. Time to find out how deep this corruption rabbit hole goes. Magnus shows up at my door at 5 a.m., eyes red from sleeplessness and hands trembling with something that isn't age. He's clutching a weathered metal box that looks like it survived both world wars and maybe the Civil War too. Couldn't stop thinking about what you said, he whispers, glancing around like we're being watched. About Brenda having federal connections. Went digging through Daddy's papers all night. Found something that'll make your blood freeze. The box hits my kitchen table with the weight of buried secrets. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that reeks of decades-old machine oil and mountain dampness, are documents that look like they belong in a museum. Daddy was more than just a logger, Magnus says, his voice barely audible. He was federal land surveyor before he retired. Kept copies of everything. Said, you never know when the government might need reminding of its own promises. The first document makes my coffee cup stop halfway to my lips. It's a federal land patent from 1887 signed by President Grover Cleveland himself, designating the entire Upper Valley as permanent watershed conservation area protected in perpetuity for environmental preservation. Magnus, this means every house in that development sits on federal land that was never supposed to be sold ever. My hands shake as I unfold a survey map that shows boundaries completely different from modern property lines. According to this century-old document, Brenda's luxury development occupies 847 acres of federally protected watershed. But the real bombshell comes in a manila folder marked fraud. Inside are photocopies of correspondence between Magnus' father and the Bureau of Land Management documenting a 1970s land grab that would make corporate raiders blush. Look at this, Magnus says, pointing to a letter dated 1973. developer Harrison Walsh had petitioned to buy conservation land for recreational development. The federal response was brutal. Request denied. Conservation status permanent and non-transferable under Federal Land Protection Act of 1906. Then comes the smoking gun, a county deed transfer dated exactly 1 year later, showing Walsh had somehow acquired title to the same federal land through local county offices, completely bypassing federal authority. This is impossible. I breathe, studying the forged signatures. You can't transfer federal conservation land through county clerks. That's what Daddy thought too, so he kept digging. Magnus produces a photograph that makes my stomach drop into my boots. It shows Walsh shaking hands with County Clerk Robert Morrison Sr., a man whose smile looks exactly like his son, the current state attorney general. The room goes silent except for the sound of my worldview crashing. Morrison's father was part of the original land fraud, which means Morrison's interest, in my case, might not be about environmental protection or fighting corruption. It might be about covering up his family's role in the biggest federal land theft in state history. Magnus, I whisper, how long have you known about Morrison's connection? Suspected for years. His daddy got rich awful fast after that land deal went through. But I needed someone smart enough to connect the dots. The old logger's eyes hold 70 years of watching corruption flourish. Someone the federal government would believe. The taste in my mouth shifts from morning coffee to metallic fear. If Morrison is protecting his father's legacy instead of fighting fraud, then I've been feeding evidence to the wrong side of this war. My phone buzzes with Morrison's number. And for the first time since this started, I'm afraid to answer. Don't tell him what we found. Magnus whispers urgently. Not yet. We need to figure out who we can really trust before this gets any deeper. The morning sun streaming through my kitchen window feels cold as winter shadows. Brenda's harassment campaign just revealed a federal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of state government. And I might have been working for the enemy all along. I spend 3 hours staring at that photograph of Morrison's father, my coffee growing cold while I calculate how thoroughly screwed I might be. Every encrypted text, every federal favor, every piece of inside information Morrison provided, was it genuine help or elaborate damage control to protect his family's legacy? My phone rings exactly at 9 a.m. Morrison's number glowing like a threat. Garrett, emergency meeting, federal task force is moving today, but we've hit complications that require immediate discussion. The word complications hits my stomach like a brick. What kind of complications? The kind that could destroy everything we've built. My office. 1 hour. After he hangs up, Magnus grabs my wrist with grip strength that could crack walnuts. Son, you walk into that office. You might not walk out with the same story you walked in with. Then what's your brilliant alternative? Magnus opens a notebook that looks like it survived the Oregon Trail. We build our own federal case. People in this valley who've been waiting decades to take down the Morrison corruption machine. The first name surprises me. Dr. Elena Vasquez. Turns out Elena's been documenting illegal mining operations across 3 counties, always watching her research disappear into the black hole of the Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Division. 20 years of geological surveys proving systematic watershed destruction, Magnus explains. 20 years of evidence that mysteriously becomes insufficient for prosecution when it hits Morrison's desk. We drive to Elena's university office where she greets us surrounded by maps that look like crime scene documentation. The scent of herbal tea can't mask the smell of frustration that permeates her research. I've been wondering when someone would finally connect these dots, she says, spreading geological surveys across her desk. Every environmental violation, illegal development, every federal land grab, they all trace back to cases that die in the state attorney general's office. The second ally makes my jaw drop. Rosa Sage, the environmental attorney who expedited my nonprofit filing. Magnus reveals she's been fighting suspicious land development for 15 years, always hitting the same bureaucratic wall. Rosa's family lost their ranch to eminent domain in 1983. Magnus says, guess who was deputy county attorney signing off on the seizure paperwork? Morrison, Sr. The student becomes the teacher. Rosa arrives looking like someone who's been waiting her entire legal career for this conversation. Her briefcase contains files that paint a picture of 40 years of systematic corruption, all protected by the Morrison family's political machine. The pattern is surgical, Rosa explains, spreading legal documents like tarot cards predicting doom. Federal land fraud cases get buried in procedural delays. Environmental crimes disappear into jurisdictional disputes. Victims get exhausted by legal costs and give up. Elena adds the scientific evidence that makes my engineering brain start calculating in overdrive. Illegal development has contaminated 3 watershed systems affecting federal forest lands. Environmental crimes on federal property trigger mandatory prosecution. Even Morrison can't make those disappear. Here's something most people don't know about federal environmental law. When conservation land gets contaminated by illegal development, the federal government has emergency powers to prosecute without state involvement. The Environmental Protection Act creates federal jurisdiction that bypasses state corruption entirely. We go around Morrison completely, Rosa says, her eyes lighting up like someone who's just discovered fire. File directly with regional federal prosecutors. Cut the state out of the loop. Magnus produces a business card so old it looks like parchment. Tommy Lightfoot, Tribal Council Environmental Officer. His grandfather's land borders the stolen federal property. Tribal nations have sovereign standing to file federal complaints that no state attorney can touch. The afternoon feels like Christmas morning for justice seekers as we plan our federal end run around 4 decades of corruption. Elena will document environmental crimes. Rosa will file federal complaints. Magnus will provide historical evidence. And Tommy will represent tribal sovereignty in federal court. But we need intelligence about Morrison's counter-moves, Rosa says. Someone he trusts to gather information about how deep this cover-up network goes. They all look at me like I just volunteered to wrestle bears. You want me to spy on the state's most powerful prosecutor? You want justice for Sarah's dream? Magnus counters, his weathered face serious as mountain granite. The sound of wind through pine trees carries the gentle music of Sarah's porch chimes, the ones she hung to bring peace to our mountain sanctuary. She'd want me to fight for truth, even if it means walking into a trap designed by the most dangerous lawyer in the state. Sometimes the most terrifying path is the only one that leads to justice. That evening, I text Morrison. Sorry about missing your call. Federal paperwork crisis with the grant. Still need that meeting? His response comes back instantly. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., private office. Come alone. The taste of fear mixes with determination as I realize I'm about to play poker with a man who's been holding all the cards for 40 years. Time to find out if I'm brave enough to call his bluff. Morrison's office reeks of leather and lies when I arrive wearing Rosa's wire. My palms sweating against the tiny recording device taped to my chest. The Attorney General greets me with his trademark smile, but something predatory lurks behind those politicians' eyes. Garrett, thank God you're here. We've uncovered disturbing evidence about Brenda's escalation. He spreads surveillance photos across his mahogany conference table. Night vision images showing figures in dark clothing, cutting cables near my solar panels, dumping chemicals near my well, planting devices around my property perimeter. Professional sabotage team, Morrison explains, his voice carrying concern that feels rehearsed. Federal surveillance caught them attempting to poison your water supply and disable your electrical systems. But here's what makes my blood freeze. These photos are too perfect, too detailed, too professionally composed. The timestamps show weeks of surveillance I never authorized using equipment I never knew existed. Morrison, I say carefully. How long have federal agents been watching my property without telling me? His pause stretches exactly 3 seconds too long. Protective surveillance started after the first harassment incidents. That's when the real trap reveals itself. Morrison slides another photo across the table. Magnus carrying his document box from my cabin. Rosa visiting with legal files. Elena photographing geological evidence around my property. Unfortunately, Morrison continues, our surveillance also captured your unauthorized meetings with individuals who may be compromising the federal investigation. The son of a has been documenting our alliance, building a case that we're interfering with federal law enforcement. Every meeting, every shared document, every piece of evidence we've gathered, all recorded by Morrison's surveillance team. My phone explodes with an emergency call that makes my heart stop beating. Garrett. Elena's voice cracks with panic. Magnus collapsed at home. Ambulance took him to Valley General. His oxygen machine failed during a power outage that only affected his house. I have to go, I say, standing so fast my chair tips backward. Morrison's expression shifts to something that might be genuine concern or perfectly practiced sympathy. Of course, but Garrett, be extremely careful. This case has attracted very dangerous attention. The 20-minute drive to the hospital feels like crossing enemy territory. Every shadow could hide surveillance. Every vehicle could contain Morrison's people. Every turn could lead to another trap. Magnus looks like he's been fighting a war and losing when I find him in the ICU connected to machines that beep like electronic death watches. But his eyes burn with the fury of a man who's seen too much mountain politics to be easily fooled. Wasn't no power outage, he whispers when I lean close enough to smell the hospital antiseptic. Heard vehicles around midnight, then someone cut my main electrical line. Oxygen machine died. Backup battery was already dead. Someone had tampered with it earlier. The metallic taste of murderous rage fills my mouth. They tried to suffocate a 78-year-old man in his sleep because he possessed documents that could expose 40 years of federal land fraud. Magnus, your father's papers hidden where they'll never find them. His weathered hand grips mine with surprising strength. But son, while I was laying there waiting for the ambulance, I saw flashlights in my house. They were searching for something. That's when Magnus delivers the bombshell that changes everything. But here's what they don't know. Daddy didn't just keep copies of the fraud documents. He kept records of every bribe, every payoff, every political favor that made the land grab possible, including canceled checks written to Robert Morrison, Sr. Elena calls while I'm still processing this revelation. My university office was destroyed. Professional job. They knew exactly which files to target, which servers to wipe. 20 years of geological evidence gone. Then Rosa Law Office burglarized. They took 15 years of federal land case files, left expensive equipment untouched. This wasn't random. They knew exactly what they wanted. The pattern crystallizes like ice forming on glass. While Morrison kept me distracted with surveillance photos and veiled threats, Brenda's team systematically eliminated evidence and attempted to murder the one witness who could prove the Morrison family's connection to the original fraud. But they made one fatal mistake. Magnus had been paranoid enough to hide multiple copies of every document in locations spread across 3 counties. Bank safety deposit boxes, tribal council archives, even waterproof containers buried on federal forest land. They think destroying our evidence will save them, I tell Elena during an emergency call. But they just proved how desperate they are. Rose's voice carries the satisfaction of a hunter who's cornered dangerous prey. Federal prosecutors in the regional office are expecting our filing tomorrow morning. Complete case package. Environmental crimes, federal land fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. The scent of hospital disinfectant can't mask the smell of justice finally approaching. But the taste in my mouth warns that cornered predators are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. Tomorrow, we trigger federal charges that will either bring justice or start a war. The next morning, I'm sitting in Magnus' hospital room helping him eat jello that tastes like artificial cherry and broken promises when his nurse delivers news that makes my blood pressure spike into orbit. Mr. Olson, there's been a court order filed for your psychiatric evaluation. Apparently, family members are concerned about your mental competency following your medical emergency. Magnus nearly chokes on his jello. What family members? I don't have any family. The nurse looks uncomfortable as she hands over legal documents that reek of expensive legal paper in desperation. A Mrs. Brenda Castellanos has petitioned the court, claiming she's acting on behalf of concerned community members who believe you're suffering from dementia-related paranoia. The sheer audacity takes my breath away. Brenda is trying to have Magnus declared mentally incompetent so his testimony about the historical documents becomes legally worthless. A man who can't testify can't expose federal land fraud. When's the hearing? I ask, scanning the legal gibberish. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., same time as some kind of federal press conference the Attorney General's office is planning. The timing isn't coincidental. Morrison is scheduling his federal announcement to coincide with Magnus being declared incompetent, neutralizing our most important witness before he can testify about the canceled checks to Morrison Sr. That afternoon, Rosa calls with news that makes the day even darker. Federal prosecutors in the regional office postponed our meeting indefinitely. They claim new evidence has emerged that requires review by the state attorney general's office first. What new evidence? They won't say, but someone with serious federal connections convinced them that our case needs state-level review before federal action. Morrison's corruption network reaches deeper into the federal system than we realized. He's using his position as state attorney general to block federal prosecutors from even reviewing our evidence. Elena arrives at the hospital that evening with geological surveys hidden in a guitar case, looking like she's been living on caffeine and determination. University administration placed me on administrative leave, pending investigation of unauthorized research activities. What unauthorized research? Documenting environmental crimes on federal land without proper permits. She laughs bitterly. 40 years of illegal development and they're investigating me for studying it without permission. That's when Dr. Franklin Pierce arrives with clipboard and condescending smile, introducing himself as the court-appointed psychiatrist who will evaluate Magnus' mental competency. The man looks like he learned psychology from watching soap operas. Mr. Olson, Pierce says in the tone people use with confused children. I understand you've been making some concerning claims about federal land fraud and government conspiracies. Magnus' weathered face hardens into granite. Son, I've been documenting government corruption since before you learned to tie your shoes. Yes, well, paranoid delusions often involve elaborate conspiracy theories that seem very real to the patient. Pierce makes notes like he's diagnosing terminal stupidity. Tell me about these supposed federal documents you claim to possess. Here's something most people don't know about involuntary psychiatric commitment. If a court-appointed evaluator declares you mentally incompetent, your testimony becomes inadmissible in any legal proceedings. It's the perfect way to silence witnesses without technically breaking any laws. Dr. Pierce, I interrupt. What are your qualifications for evaluating federal land fraud cases? His smile falters slightly. I evaluate mental competency, not land disputes. So, you're not qualified to determine whether federal documents are authentic or not. That's not relevant to my assessment. That's when Rosa appears in the doorway with 2 federal marshals and legal documents that make Pierce's face go white as hospital sheets. Dr. Pierce, you're served with federal subpoenas requiring testimony about your financial relationship with Cascade Valley Estates HOA. Pierce's clipboard hits the floor with a clatter that echoes through the hospital corridor. I don't have any financial relationship with any HOA. Bank records show 5 payments of $10,000 each over the past 6 months, Rosa continues, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor delivering a kill shot. All from accounts controlled by Brenda Castellanos. The federal marshals escort Pierce away while he protests his innocence to anyone who will listen. Another piece of Brenda's corruption network exposed and neutralized. But the real victory comes when Tommy Lighted arrives with news that changes the entire game. Tribal Council filed federal complaints directly with the Department of Justice. Sovereign nation status bypasses all state-level interference. Rosa's eyes light up with the glow of legal vindication. DOJ has jurisdiction over federal land crimes regardless of state attorney general objections. Morrison can't block this. That evening, as sunset paints the hospital walls in shades of gold and justice, Magnus grins like a man who's finally lived long enough to see his enemies cornered. Son, he says, his voice stronger than it's been all day. Tomorrow is going to be very interesting. The taste of federal justice feels sweeter than hospital jello. Brenda's desperate attempt to silence our witness just exposed her bribery network to federal prosecutors who can't be controlled by Morrison's influence. Sometimes your enemy's desperation becomes your greatest weapon. The county courthouse steps look like a media circus when I arrive the next morning with news vans from 3 networks, federal agents in dark suits, and a crowd that includes half the valley's population. The air buzzes with tension thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Morrison stands at a podium flanked by FBI agents and federal prosecutors, looking like a man who's about to announce either victory or surrender. Behind him, Brenda sits with her legal team, wearing the expression of someone who thinks she's about to be vindicated. She has no idea what's coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison begins, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza. "Today, we announce the conclusion of a federal investigation into corruption and fraud affecting Cascade Valley." The crowd murmurs with anticipation while I position myself near the courthouse steps, close enough to see Brenda's confident smirk. She actually thinks Morrison's federal announcement will clear her name and destroy my credibility. Over the past months, federal investigators have uncovered evidence of systematic fraud involving illegal land transfers, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Brenda's smirk starts to waver as Morrison's tone becomes more pro-seal than celebratory. Federal agents have documented a pattern of corruption spanning 4 decades involving the illegal transfer of federally protected conservation land to private developers through fraudulent county office procedures. That's when the bomb drops. Today, federal prosecutors are announcing criminal indictments against multiple defendants involved in what the Department of Justice calls the largest federal land fraud case in regional history. Brenda's face cycles through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as FBI agents move through the crowd toward the defendant's seating area. The first defendant, Brenda Castellanos, faces charges including conspiracy to defraud the federal government, environmental crimes on federal property, attempted murder, and operating a criminal enterprise under the RICO Act. The courthouse plaza erupts as FBI agents place handcuffs on Brenda while news cameras capture every moment. Her confident smirk has been replaced by the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. Federal investigation has also revealed systematic bribery of county officials, falsification of environmental reports, and attempts to silence witnesses through violence and intimidation. Dr. Pierce is led away in handcuffs, followed by Dale Kruger and Rico Castellanos. The courthouse steps look like a perwalk for an entire corruption network. But then Morrison delivers the revelation that changes everything. Federal prosecutors have also uncovered evidence that this corruption network extends into state government, including attempts to obstruct federal justice through abuse of prosecutorial authority. My blood turns to ice water as I realize what's happening. Morrison isn't protecting his father's legacy. He's burning it down to save himself. As State Attorney General, I am announcing my recusal from this case due to potential conflicts of interest involving my late father's role in the original 1970s land transfers. The crowd goes silent except for the mechanical war of news cameras recording political suicide in real time. That's when Tommy Lightfoot approaches the podium with Magnus, who looks frail but determined as he carries a folder of documents that could rewrite 40 years of local history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison continues, "federal investigation has been assisted by historical documentation provided by Valley residents who preserved evidence of the original fraud for over 4 decades. Magnus opens his folder with hands that shake slightly, not from age, but from the weight of finally revealing secrets he's carried for most of his adult life. These documents prove that federal conservation land was illegally transferred through bribery and fraud, that subsequent development has caused millions of dollars in environmental damage, and that attempts to cover up these crimes have involved systematic corruption of local and state government." The sound of flashbulbs and shouting reporters fills the courthouse plaza as federal agents escort the entire conspiracy network toward waiting vehicles. Elena appears beside me with a grin that could power the entire valley. Federal Environmental Protection Agency is taking custody of all illegally developed federal land. Restoration begins immediately. Rosa joins us with legal documents that smell like victory and justice. Federal court has approved a $50 million victim compensation fund for displaced homeowners. No innocent families will lose their homes without fair compensation. But the sweetest moment comes when I see Sarah's dream finally becoming reality. A federal marshal hands me documents establishing the Sarah Reynolds Federal Environmental Learning Center with $5 million in federal funding for environmental education programs. The taste of justice feels better than anything I've experienced since Sarah's death. Federal law enforcement has dismantled an entire corruption network while protecting innocent victims and ensuring environmental restoration. As news helicopters circle overhead and federal agents secure evidence that will keep prosecutors busy for years, I realize that sometimes fighting corruption requires patience.